January 17, 1945. Somewhere over the dark forests of the Ardennes, the night is absolute. No moon, no stars, only the hum of engines cutting through frozen air at 12,000 feet. In the cockpit of a Northrop P-61 Black Widow, First Lieutenant Paul Smith feels the vibration through his gloves, a deep, steady pulse that seems too slow, too heavy for a fighter. Behind him, his radar operator hunches over the glowing scope, watching green blips dance across the screen like fireflies in a void. The aircraft feels massive around them, nearly twice the size of the Messerschmitts and Fokker-Wulfs they've been briefed to hunt. Smith adjusts his oxygen mask and thinks about what the Luftwaffe pilots have been saying in intercepted communications, that the American night fighter is a lumbering giant, too slow to catch anything that doesn't want to be caught, too clumsy to fight anything nimble enough to turn. He thinks about this as his radar operator's voice crackles through the intercom. Contact, bearing 270, range 4 miles. 50 minutes later, 7 German aircraft would be falling through that same darkness, trailing fire like broken stars. The P-61 Black Widow was never supposed to inspire confidence in German pilots, but it was never supposed to exist at all. When the United States entered the war in December 1941, the Army Air Forces possessed no dedicated night fighter, no aircraft designed from the ground up to hunt in darkness, to turn night from an ally of the bomber into a killing ground. The British had learned this lesson the hard way during the Blitz, when German bombers crossed the channel under cover of darkness and British fighters groped blindly through the void, relying on searchlights and luck. The solution had been the Bristol Beaufighter and later the de Havilland Mosquito, fast, radar-equipped hunters that could find and destroy bombers before they reached their targets. America, watching from across the Atlantic, understood that it would need the same capability. What it created instead was something no one expected. A fighter that weighed nearly 30,000 pounds fully loaded, carried a crew of 3, and mounted 4 20mm cannons and 4 50 caliber machine guns. It was not fast by fighter standards. Its maximum speed of 366 miles per hour was respectable, but hardly extraordinary. It was not nimble. Its wingspan stretched over 60 feet, wider than a B-25 Mitchell bomber, but it was lethal in ways that German intelligence had failed to anticipate, and German pilots had failed to respect. By the winter of 1945, the Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self. The vast armadas that had darkened the skies over Poland and France were gone, consumed by attrition over the Eastern Front, bled dry over the Reich itself as American bombers turned German cities into furnaces. But the night fighters remained, elite units equipped with Messerschmitt Beitzerem 110s, and Junkers Ju-88s fitted with radar and upward-firing cannons. Pilots who had learned to hunt British bombers in the dark and had adapted those skills to the American bomber streams. These men were professionals, survivors of years of combat, and they had developed a contempt for American night operations. The Americans, they believed, were daylight fighters, bold and aggressive in sunshine, but clumsy and uncertain when the sun went down. And when intelligence reports began describing the P-61, that contempt deepened into something close to amusement. A 3-man crew, a fighter the size of a medium bomber, a maximum speed barely faster than the bombers it was meant to protect. One Luftwaffe pilot captured later in the war would tell his interrogators that the P-61 had been called der Schwarze Elefant, the black elephant. Big, slow, impossible to miss, easy to avoid, easier still to kill if you were foolish enough to engage it. They had misunderstood everything. The P-61 was slow, but only in the way a shark is slow compared to a barracuda. Its 4 Pratt & Whitney R2800 engines, the same power plants that drove the P-47 Thunderbolt, gave it a rate of climb that belied its size, and its long wings provided a turning radius that shocked pilots accustomed to thinking of maneuverability in terms of wingspan and weight. But more than that, the Black Widow had been designed around a principle that the Luftwaffe night fighters understood but had never faced from an American opponent. It was a system, not just an aircraft. Its SER-720 airborne interception radar could detect targets at ranges exceeding 5 miles, and its radar operator seated behind the pilot in a compartment filled with scopes and dials could guide the pilot onto an intercept while the target was still invisible. The pilot did not need to see the enemy. He only needed to place his aircraft where the radar operator told him, close the distance, and wait for the target to materialize in the faint glow of exhaust flames or the silhouette against clouds. Then the 4 cannons and 4 machine guns, mounted in the belly of the aircraft in a turret that could traverse and elevate, would speak, and the night would erupt in traces and fire. German pilots expected American fighters to behave like P-51s and P-47s, aggressive, direct, reliant on speed and firepower. They expected the P-61 to be a clumsy predator, easy to evade with a sharp turn or a sudden dive. What they encountered instead was something patient and methodical, an aircraft that stalked rather than chased, that closed distance with a relentless certainty that felt less like combat and more like execution. In the skies over Germany and occupied Europe, the P-61 began racking up kills at a rate that stunned both American commanders and German intelligence. But it was over the Ardennes during the final weeks of the Battle of the Bulge that the Black Widow would demonstrate just how completely the Luftwaffe had misjudged it. The night of January 17, 1945 was supposed to be routine. German night fighters had been harassing American supply lines and troop concentrations, exploiting the darkness to strike and vanish, before Allied fighters could respond. The P-61s of the 4022nd Night Fighter Squadron had been scrambled to intercept. Standard procedure, a patrol pattern over the battle zone, radar eyes scanning the darkness. Lieutenant Smith and his crew were not expecting contact. They were expecting cold monotony, and the faint hope that something might appear on the scope before their fuel ran low and they had to return to base. When the first contact appeared, Smith felt his heartbeat quicken. His radar operator, Staff Sergeant Robert Tierney, called out the bearing and range, his voice calm and professional. Smith banked toward the contact, throttling up, feeling the P-61 respond with a ponderous grace that always surprised him. The target was moving fast, likely a Ju-88 based on speed and altitude. Smith closed the distance, watching his airspeed indicator climb, listening to Tierney's updates. 3 miles, 2 miles, 1 mile. Then he saw it, a dark shape against darker sky, exhaust flames flickering like distant candles. Smith eased the Black Widow into position, lining up the shot, feeling the aircraft settle into the steady, controlled flight that preceded firing. He squeezed the trigger. The cannons roared, a sound like tearing metal, and the night lit up in a strobe of muzzle flashes. The Ju-88 seemed to hesitate in mid-air, then rolled left and began trailing smoke. Smith followed, firing again, and the German aircraft disintegrated in a ball of orange fire that fell away into the darkness below. Tierney's voice came through the intercom, still calm. Second contact, bearing 315, range 5 miles. For the next 47 minutes, Smith and his crew hunted. The second kill came 8 minutes after the first, a Bf-1110 that tried to dive away and found the P-61 diving faster, closing the gap until Smith's cannons shredded its tail section. The third came 12 minutes later, another Ju-88 that attempted to outrun the Black Widow and learned too late that the P-61 could sustain its speed longer than the German aircraft could maintain full throttle. The fourth and fifth kills came almost simultaneously, 2 Bf-1110s flying in loose formation, both caught in a single pass as Smith raked his fire across both aircraft and watched them tumble away trailing flames. The sixth was a Heinkel, He-219, ironically, Germany's own night fighter, equipped with radar and upward-firing cannons, the closest equivalent to the P-61 that the Luftwaffe possessed. It tried to turn inside Smith's radius, tried to bring its own guns to bear and failed. Smith's cannons found it in the turn, punching through the cockpit and engine nacelles, and it rolled inverted and fell. The seventh kill came at the edge of Smith's fuel reserves, another Ju-88 flying low and fast toward the Rhine, trying to escape. Smith pushed the P-61 into a shallow dive, feeling the airspeed build past 400 miles per hour faster than the Black Widow was ever supposed to fly, faster than the Germans believed it could fly. Tierney called out the range, his voice tight now, aware that they were minutes from having to break off and head for home. Smith closed to within 1,000 feet, lined up the shot, and fired. The Ju-88 exploded so violently that debris rattled against the P-61's fuselage, and Smith had to bank hard to avoid flying through the fireball. Then silence. Darkness. The hum of engines and the crackle of the radio. Smith turned the Black Widow west, toward base, and keyed his microphone. 7 confirmed kills, he reported, his voice flat and exhausted. Returning to base. Fuel critical. The sortie would be analyzed, debriefed and documented. Intelligence officers would pore over Smith's combat report, cross-referencing times and locations with German radio intercepts and loss records. The Luftwaffe had lost, not 7 but 9 aircraft that night over the Ardennes. 2 more had crashed attempting to evade Allied night fighters, running out of fuel or misjudging altitude in the darkness. But it was Smith's 7 kills in 50 minutes that became legend, passed through squadrons and groups, cited in training manuals and after-action reports. For the Luftwaffe, it was a revelation and a catastrophe. The P-61, the aircraft they had mocked as too slow and too clumsy, had destroyed 7 of their best night fighters in less than an hour. Pilots who had survived encounters with the Black Widow began describing it differently, not as a lumbering elephant, but as something patient and inexorable, something that hunted with a mechanical precision that felt inhuman. One captured pilot, interrogated in February 1945, would describe the experience of being pursued by a P-61. You cannot see it. You only know it is there because your radar warns you or because your wingman explodes. You turn and it turns. You dive and it dives. You cannot escape it. You can only hope it runs out of fuel before it kills you. What the Germans had failed to understand was that the P-61 was not designed to dogfight. It was designed to kill, and those are not the same thing. Dogfighting required speed and agility, the ability to outturn and outclimb an opponent in a swirling knife fight, where fractions of a second determined survival. Killing required only patience, precision, and overwhelming firepower applied at the moment of maximum advantage. The P-61 excelled at this, because it had been built around the radar, around the idea that the pilot did not need to see the enemy until it was too late for the enemy to react. The Black Widow's crews learned to trust the radar absolutely, to follow intercept vectors with a faith that bordered on religious, to close distance in darkness, and fire only when the target filled their gun sight. And the aircraft itself, slow, heavy, ungainly, became irrelevant. Speed did not matter when you approached from behind and below, invisible until your cannons opened fire. Maneuverability did not matter when your target never saw you coming. The symbolic object of the P-61's dominance was not the radar, though the radar made it possible. It was the cannon, the 4 Hispano 20mm autocannons mounted in the belly turret, each capable of firing 750 rounds per minute, each round weighing 4 ounces and capable of punching through aluminum, steel and flesh with equal ease. German pilots had grown accustomed to the 50 caliber machine guns of American fighters, dangerous but survivable if the burst was short or the range long. The 20mm cannon was different. A single hit could sever a control cable, puncture a fuel tank, kill a crewman. A sustained burst could saw an aircraft in half. The sound of those cannons became the last thing many Luftwaffe pilots heard, a deep, hammering roar that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, followed by the shriek of metal tearing and the roar of flame. Survivors described it as the sound of industrial machinery, cold and impersonal, the sound of a factory processing raw materials, which, in a sense it was. The abundance that the cannon represented was not just firepower but choice. American factories produced 20mm rounds by the millions, shipped them across oceans, stockpiled them at airfields from England to the Philippines. German industry, by contrast, was collapsing under the weight of strategic bombing and resource shortages. Luftwaffe night fighters often flew with half-empty ammunition bins, conserving rounds for the most critical moments. American pilots could afford to fire long bursts, to saturate a target area with explosive shells, to destroy an enemy aircraft so completely that no question of the kill remained. This was the industrial logic of American warfare, not just superior technology, but the ability to deploy that technology in quantities that made resistance futile. The P-61 was not faster than German night fighters. It was not more maneuverable, but it carried more guns, more ammunition, more fuel and more sophisticated radar, and it was backed by a supply chain that could replace losses faster than the enemy could inflict them. By the spring of 1945, the Luftwaffe had largely abandoned night operations over the Western Front. The losses were unsustainable, the risk too great. American night fighters, P-61s and also radar-equipped P-38s, and British Mosquitoes owned the darkness, and German pilots who ventured into it rarely returned. The mockery had turned to respect, then to fear, then to avoidance. In captured documents and interrogation reports, the tone shifted. The P-61 was no longer discussed with contempt, but with a kind of weary resignation, the acknowledgement that the Americans had solved a problem the Germans had thought unsolvable. How do you fight an enemy you cannot see? How do you evade a hunter that tracks you through invisible means? The answer German pilots learned was that you did not. You stayed on the ground, or you flew during the day and accepted the risk of encountering P-51s and P-47s. The night belonged to America. Lieutenant Smith would survive the war, fly 23 more combat missions, and return to the United States with a distinguished flying cross and a reputation as one of the deadliest night fighter pilots in the European theater. He would rarely speak of the night he killed 7 German aircraft in 50 minutes, and when pressed he would deflect credit to his crew, to the radar operator and gunner who had made the kills possible. But in private moments he would remember the feeling of the P-61 responding to his touch, the way it had felt less like a machine and more like an extension of his will, patient and relentless, and utterly without mercy. He would remember the darkness, and the fires falling through it and the silence that followed. The story of the P-61 Black Widow is not the story of a fighter that was faster or more agile than its enemies. It is the story of a weapon system that redefined what a fighter could be, a fusion of technology, tactics, and industrial capacity that turned night from a refuge into a hunting ground. The German pilots who mocked it had been trained in an older conception of air combat, one where speed and maneuverability determined outcomes, where the better pilot in the better aircraft would always prevail. The P-61 rendered that conception obsolete. It did not need to be faster if it could find you first. It did not need to be more agile if it could position itself before you knew it was there. It only needed to be present, patient, and armed with enough firepower to destroy you in a single punch. And in that transformation from mocked to feared, from underestimated to dominant, there is a larger truth about the nature of technological warfare and the industrial democracies that waged. The United States did not win the air war because it built better pilots or better aircraft, though it often did both. It won because it built enough aircraft, enough radar sets, enough ammunition, enough fuel and enough training infrastructure to sustain losses that would have broken other nations and still press forward. The P-61 was a product of that system, a weapon that could only exist in a nation with the resources to design, build and deploy a 3-man night fighter carrying a ton of electronics and a ton of ammunition. Germany had produced the Ju-21, a night fighter arguably superior in some respects to the P-61, but it built fewer than 300 of them. The United States built more than 700 Black Widows, deployed them to every theater, and used them until there was nothing left to hunt. The night of January 17, 1945, was not the night the Luftwaffe died. That death was a slow process, a grinding attrition across years and continents. But it was a night when the mythology died, the belief that superior skill and superior courage could overcome superior resources, that the night could still be a sanctuary, that the Americans were daylight fighters who stumbled in the dark. 7 German aircraft fell in 50 minutes, and with them fell the last pretense that the war could be anything but what it had become, a contest of industrial capacity, of logistics and supply chains, of factories and assembly lines. The P-61 was slow, but so is an avalanche, and just as impossible to outrun once it begins to move. In the end, the lesson was simple and brutal: you do not mock what you do not understand. And in the darkness over Europe, there was much the Luftwaffe had failed to understand about radar, about tactics, about the patient lethality of an aircraft, designed not to dogfight but to kill. The Black Widow was never the fastest fighter in the sky. It did not need to. It only needed to be there in the darkness, waiting.